I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Inez Stepman.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So this week, an incredible amount of things have happened this week. It's one of those, weeks in which it feels like months happen. We'll kick it off with Amber talking about the vice presidential debate. I'll talk about Hurricane Helene and its impacts. Ben will be talking about Israel and all the crazy stuff that's been happening there with the assassination of Nasrallah and then the ballistic missile strikes last night by Iran. And then finally, Inez will talk about the Dockworkers strike. So to kick it off, let's go to Amber.
Great, thanks. And I'll keep my remarks brief and let y'all talk as much as possible to avoid potential train Wi-Fi outage. I'm actually on my way back from New York after covering the debate last night. And I think it's fair to say that Tim Walz was very unprepared and underestimated JD Vance. He came out swinging from the very first question. Tim Walz was immediately on defense, turning the conversation to Trump on the first answer about the Iran strike against Israel. And it didn't get much better from there. The Democrats are fundraising mostly on this moment where JD Vance didn't say whether or not Trump lost the 2020 election. Outside of that, even listening to mainstream media prognosticators, all believe that Vance had basically wiped the floor with Tim Walz. It was a brutal night for the Democrats. And then meanwhile, on the Republican side, you have to imagine that Trump is feeling very vindicated. There were a lot of questions from people within the party who thought that JD Vance was the wrong pick because of the immediate opposition research that came out on him. I imagine that he's feeling very proud right now and like he made the right choice. With that, I'll tee it up for you guys. We could probably get into some of the specific issues that they talked about and maybe some of the better answers. And also if we think that this is going to have any legitimate impact on the race.
Go ahead.
I'll go ahead. I think Vance was dominant last night. It was one of the best debate performances I've ever seen. He was clearly outclassing him, and Tim Walz looked like a deer in the headlights for much of the debate. He started out extremely nervous. You could tell that he was just kind of like shaking, and he just looked like he didn't belong there. It was very dramatic in the sense of, you could see the guy and you're like, oh, he seems kind of nice, but he has no business being at this level of American politics. Like, he has no business running the country. He would be utterly inept and feeble. And God forbid he ever were in a position to like negotiate on the Americans' behalf. He'd just get absolutely steamrolled. So I thought Vance was excellent. He had total command on policy, very, very in the details, very articulate, but also very fluid and personable. And I think, if people watched that debate and they had heard, Vance is weird, Vance is terrible, they would have come away thinking those people are crazy. Vance is very on top of it. In terms of impact, I think this will help Trump a little bit. If people are scared of JD Vance, I think this takes it away if they watch the debate. I also think Tim Walz didn't really do much for Kamala Harris at all in terms of really persuading anybody that, oh, this is a person we should have be president. I was listening to some Democrat commentary after the debate to try and understand where they were coming from. And they were like, well, it started off a little shaky, but Walz totally won the debate with his questions about January 6th to Vance. And Vance didn't have a good enough answer. I just thought that was kind of weak. So, and I think Crystal Civita had a point on Twitter or in an article that I thought was right on, where he said, if somebody's voting with January 6th as their top priority, they're already voting for Kamala Harris. Like, normal people with actual, real, tangible concerns going forward are going to vote for somebody else.
Yeah. My favorite moment of the debate was actually, Walz was so outclassed. I think that's the right word, Will. My favorite moment of the debate was Vance's exchange with the moderators, who once again got into the arguing and fact-checking business, and then were fact-checked by Vance on a subject of some import, by the way, about the quote-unquote legal status of Haitian migrants in Springfield, and the illegitimate legal status that they hold. But that was my favorite moment of the debate. I thought it was well-deserved that he kept talking over them, because they, as per usual, in every debate we talk about this, we complain about it. To some extent, there's no point in complaining about it, but they were incredibly biased. And in this case, they were factually wrong and talking over the candidate and not allowing him to speak to the American people, which is the entire point of these debates. So that was a key moment for me. That was my favorite moment. I also agree with Will about the skepticism on the right about Vance. I know that I've made a bit of a point almost, every other week or something of pointing out that Vance has been very good. He's been a really good pick for Trump. He has some of the strengths that Trump doesn't have. He's not competing with Trump in terms of being incredibly funny or being the top of the ticket, but he is very articulate. He's great with hostile media. He has the policy chops and the competence that I think is if you were a little bit worried perhaps about some of Trump's sort of personality characteristics, actually I think Vance is a very good balance for Trump in that respect. And frankly, I think it does say a lot about the right that there's such a large part of the commentariat of the right that was immediately willing to seize on this whole manufactured thing about Vance being weird. Now everybody has seen in the debate, he's not weird. He's articulate. He's clear. He's decisive. These are all good things for a politician. Personally, I was breathing a happy sigh of relief. It's an active relief to have somebody representing the right in the media in an articulate, intelligent way who argues back and has the sort of depth of policy and factual knowledge to argue back against the media when they mischaracterize things. Anyway, I do think that this should be a message, not that it'll be taken, but it should be a message to a lot of people on the right, on the sort of professional right, that they thought that Vance was such a bad pick. And really what they fell for was a manufactured media narrative about a subtle quality of how he was allegedly weird, right? And I think that should be a lesson. It probably won't be. In terms of, I guess, just two more brief remarks. One, to me, the essence of Walz's performance was a moment where he said, "I'm a knucklehead. I'm often a knucklehead and need correction." That's Walz's entire persona. I find it really off-putting for anyone who is running to take an extremely powerful office. This kind of faux, oh, I'm worthless. I need to be corrected by my betters. It's a way of slowing off the responsibility of power. And as we've said many, many times on this show, there is no accountability for wielding enormous power in the American government right now. That is one of her key problems, right? Also, Walz's repeated references to the experts, he is a good stand-in for a DC class of leftists who avoid the responsibilities of power when things go wrong, but wield a lot of it, and then sort of outsource their judgment to experts that have been wrong about a lot of things in the last 30 years and certainly in the last 5. So I think this was a great debate for Vance. I think it will matter to the extent that, again, there are not that many opportunities for either Trump or Vance to speak directly to the American people without the filter of a media that is actively running a campaign for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. So to that extent, even though I don't think this is a game changer in the election, I do think it matters. I think it's several good little coins on the right side of the scale.
I think Vance's performance was masterful. He showed command of the topics. He was able to pivot off of the ludicrous framing of questions from regime moderators, so-called moderators, in the normal default 3-on-1 format. Watching it, it sort of looked like there was teacher and pupil. And you saw that in the sense that Walz was kind of nodding along and being convinced of the merits of J.D. Vance's arguments in real time, which was kind of cringeworthy on some levels, but also I think showed you how compelling Vance's answers were. I think he came off not only as in command, and obviously he could be wonky if he wanted to be. I thought the moderators walked into a trap by talking about, well, can you show evidence of a link between illegal aliens and housing prices? Of course he's going to be able to come up with a study that's going to be able to substantiate his claims, whereas Tim Walz was basically fluff the entire time. After his terrible start, I think Walz was smart to tack to the kind of one-liners and the canned cliches that I'm sure he had prepped in advance. But it was clear that on the substance and style as well. He got his clock cleaned during the debate. I do think it was interesting that Vance didn't really go at Walz as a useful idiot of the Chinese Communist Party, even when there was the opening on the Tiananmen answer. Didn't really go at Walz's radicalism all that hard. And it struck me that part of this was about focusing on Harris. Another part of it was who were each of these people trying to talk to in this debate. And I think for Vance, it was pretty clear that he wanted to come off as relatable and amiable to Americans broadly, but probably to the Rust Belt and the swing states in particular, as not someone who is strident necessarily or heavily ideological, but for the common good. And I think it's also notable that he tried to hang a lantern on the perceived problem of abortion, which to me speaks to the fact that he's trying to thread the needle between not alienating conservatives on this issue, but also appealing broadly, probably to the suburbs in this country, to suburban women and wobblies in kind of purple districts. And we'll see if ultimately the way that he threaded that needle was effective. But I think the focus on pro-family, increasing options for women, making it so that it's not perceived that having a baby is a burden or going to wreck one's life. That was a powerful rhetorical message, and we'll see if ultimately Republicans nationally kind of glom onto it. But that kind of hang a lantern on your problem approach, I thought was interesting and shrewd.
All right. Next topic is, incredibly consequential. We had Hurricane Helene. And, just so you know, I live in Tallahassee, and the hurricane was projected to go right over Tallahassee. So, and I live in a house with a lot of tall pine trees surrounding it that kind of were a little bit worrisome. So we actually got out of town. We drove all the way to North Carolina, which we didn't think would get the brunt of it, but it turns out not where I was in North Carolina in Greensboro, but in Western North Carolina took an absolute beating from Hurricane Helene. So it's a Category 4 hurricane. It did a lot of damage in Florida in the sense of the storm surge, which is very common. You had a lot of flooding in places like Tampa. And in particular, you have a lot of these little small communities that are in the Florida Big Bend, kind of in between the Panhandle and the big peninsula of Florida. And they've had 3 hurricanes in a year and 2 of them very serious, Idalia and then this one. And, I drove home on Monday and actually drove through the area where this hurricane went through, and it's just nothing but snap trees all littering the highway. It's really amazing that they cleared out, which gets to the first point I want to talk about, which is Ron DeSantis did an incredible job, as we're very used to him being in extremely good form whenever it comes to hurricane preparation. And it's not just Governor DeSantis who did good, but it's really, Florida is the story of 20 years of excellent Republican governance and building up state capacity to the point that people here are very prepared for hurricanes. They listen to the emergency responders who've built up, their ability to communicate with the public very effectively. And they're able to bring in linemen and fix power almost immediately. I think, within 48 hours, you had 90% of the power back. And by now it almost certainly is all back. So Florida does it really well. North Carolina, on the other hand, we have a massive flooding tragedy going on in Western North Carolina up in the Appalachians. Cities like Boone, close to actually where I got married in Blowing Rock, were flooded out. Asheville, further west, took an absolute beating. Massive destruction. I think what I'm hearing is about 600 people are still missing. There's only one road in and out of the area that's functional, Highway 40, the big interstate. A massive amount of it collapsed off of the hill, and so it's not even usable. And it's just a real tragedy for all the people that live in Asheville and in the surrounding counties. I'm just hoping they do well. I'm thinking about how we could hopefully do better. And what happened in North Carolina? It's clearly North Carolina doesn't have enough emergencies like this. And also, I noticed that their ability to communicate with the public was just not very strong. Roy Cooper doesn't have a big social media following. I looked at the content that their Department of Emergency Management was putting out. It wasn't getting any views. So nobody, even if they were warning people, hey, you need to evacuate, there's going to be record catastrophic flooding, the message wasn't heard. And, whether I think that's actually a responsibility of governments is to actually build up their ability to communicate with the public so that when there is an emergency, they can be taken seriously and get people out of harm's way. But I'm curious, what you guys think about the hurricane and what's going on in North Carolina and Tennessee.
Well, I saw the videos of Blowing Rock and immediately thought of your wedding, Will, and that was the first and only time that I've been there. And I think the coffee shop that we went to the morning before your wedding is totally gone. It's really sad. I have some friends in Asheville who have had to go go stay with friends for a while because their homes are completely covered. And unfortunately, we've seen a severe lack of leadership from federal government on this issue. And we have Biden sitting on the beach on Sunday after the worst of the flooding hit Asheville. We have Kamala Harris doing campaign events in Nevada for Sunday night. Donald Trump managed to make it to Georgia before either Kamala or Biden had returned to the White House for an in-person briefing. And Joe Biden defended himself by saying, well, I was using the phone. I was on phone calls. And that simply wasn't good enough for a disaster of this level, and was a scary reminder that we are woefully lacking in executive leadership at this moment.
Yeah, really agree with Amber's last sentence about lack of leadership, both in this case on the federal and on the state level. I suspect the more we learn about this, the worse it's going to get, right? It looks like there was functionally very little, organized response. I mean, the stories that are coming out from Western North Carolina are stories of completely preventable deaths and destruction, where I understand, like, this is I take Will's point that, Western North Carolina is not prepared for this level of hurricane because it doesn't happen there very often, the way that Florida, of course, their response is good also because of good governance, but also, like, they have to deal with this a lot. So, there's more practice and incentive to build up the infrastructure that's necessary to respond to this kind of disaster in a way that is just not true in Western North Carolina. Okay, so take that sort of reasonable parameter point. But even considering that, it seems like people were just abandoned, like they were just left on their roofs. And there was no, structured effort to make sure that they had basic supplies, food, water, medicine. And those are the reports that were coming out that are even more disturbing, right? You can't stop the hurricane, but this kind of response, a lot of the suffering seems to have been after the fact and preventable based on the stories that are coming out right now. And so I suspect that's what we're going to be learning over the course of the next few days or even the next week, is how much of this suffering it was rectifiable or preventable, as opposed to the part of it that wasn't. Was the infrastructure, Highway 40, there's reports about a dam also, right? Was the infrastructure prepared the way it should have been? Was the response from the state organized in the way that it could have been to at least minimize the consequences of this terrible hurricane on American citizens? And it seems like, from initial reports, which again, I don't want to make too much of, but it seems like the answer is no. And in terms of the election and politics, I think we have not yet seen how important this hurricane and the response will be in this election. I mean, this could be a kind of Katrina level political event for the election. I think it could be very, very bad for Kamala Harris, because she is in charge, as JD Vance said over and over again. Why didn't she do all of these things she's saying while she's been VP of the country for the last, and functionally the president for the last month? But regardless, I think this has the possibility to really be a scandal of American failures and American governance on behalf of the American people. And obviously, I echo everything that Will and Amber said about, hoping that everybody who is affected by this is doing okay, or at least in short order will receive the help that they deserve. Just awful stories, awful videos coming out from Western North Carolina.
Yeah, this is a catastrophe, and it's striking to me that in the face of it, the basic kind of fundamental duty of executives and based upon the precedent of the state level and then at the federal level, is you have a plan in place, you articulate that plan clearly, you surge the resources necessary, you show command and leadership, you get rid of whatever red tape is in the way to ensure that the people who need the support get it, and you apply it vigorously and without delay. And for the president and the vice president, you certainly have to be communicating with the American people openly and honestly about it. I mean, you would think the first thing that would have been done after this natural disaster is to say, here's the plan in place. We're going to do X, Y, and Z. We're going to work with authorities to ensure that this is a seamless effort with professionalism and move forward. And then obviously go down to every site you can go down to at a bare minimum, increase morale among the impacted parties. And, to that end, just like with East Palestine as well, Donald Trump seems to show more of an understanding of what leadership looks like in a crisis situation. Despite the trillions of dollars that we spend on all manner of inanities over the years, when it comes to basic responses, like responses to natural disasters, it seems like as a country, we're caught flat-footed and authorities can't execute their basic duties and functions. And I hate to go to the political aspect of, sort of politicizing responses to disasters, but obviously that's a precedent that the regime media in particular has created. So my mind, of course, went to Katrina immediately. If the shoe were on the other foot, it's obvious people would be calling this Trump's Katrina if it happened under Donald Trump, and they would be using it in all manner of ways to try to undermine him in the run-up to an election. And you'd have sob stories of individuals attacking the administration on the ground, attacking any Republican leaders who could be attacked in order to gain political points. And again, I find that disgusting and abhorrent. But on the other hand, it's just obvious the hypocrisy and how brazen the sort of disparity is in the treatment of a catastrophe like this. So, whether and to what extent this matters when it comes to Election Day, I think is to be seen. But either way, it's catastrophic, I think, all around.
All right. With that, let's move on to Ben, right back to you in Israel. And what's been going, a lot of crazy stuff been going on. So.
Yeah, so it's tough to even lay out a timeline that does justice to kind of the back and forth of the situation. But obviously, most recently, we saw around 200 ballistic missiles launched from Iran at Israel at heavy civilian centers, population centers, reportedly, at least in the early going, and I haven't looked for corroborating evidence, but potentially targeting of Israeli military bases as well. This is the second such aerial attack on Israel directly from Iran, which it was unprecedented when it transpired in April. Now this is the second time. So I think there's a question of, and I raised this at the time back in April, is this essentially being normalized? Recall that back in April, the Biden administration essentially called it a victory and told Israel to take the win, the fact that there was even an aerial attack. And basically legitimized the notion that Iran could engage in such an attack. This time, the Biden administration claims there's going to be severe consequences for the attack, while also, again, trying to take credit for assisting with Israel and coordinating in defense. You'll recall in the April time, this was in response to Israeli assassination of Iran-linked leaders. This time around, or last time around rather, the administration tried to use, I argued, the notion that the U.S. was helping provide Israel's defense and coordinating with Arab partners to provide Israel's aerial defenses as a justification to handcuff, constrain, bear hug Israel to say, see, all of this can be yours, all of this comedy with the Arab states around you and all these defenses can be yours if you'll just come to a ceasefire in Gaza, not win the war, not destroy and eliminate Hamas, not protect your interests going forward in Gaza, certainly not strike Hezbollah in Lebanon, and basically also at the end agree to a so-called two-state solution, which would provide untenable borders for Israel and leave it at threat of myriad October 7th. That's what happened in April. This time around, the administration and its response has been a little bit more muted, and I think it's in part because of what preceded the aerial attack, which was First of all, the pager attack, which not only debilitated Hezbollah's ranks, but also threatened its entire command and control and communications infrastructure. And then essentially the assassinating of all of Hezbollah's leadership, right up to the number one man, Nasrallah, who had reigned for multiple decades. His predecessor as well had also been assassinated by Israel previously. Um, that obviously may have put Hezbollah into chaos. It's not clear what the leadership looks like. It's not clear what its capabilities look like. It's yet to be seen, however, what the regrouping looks like, what their munitions stockpiles look like, where their missile stockpiles are at this point, and what capabilities they might bring to bear. But it's got to be understood that Hezbollah essentially is the first line of defense and the chief deterrent against Israel taking any sort of decisive action against Iran's strategic infrastructure, including its nuclear facilities, its air force, shipping, oil, and beyond. So the fact that Hezbollah was debilitated really potentially weakens Iran and its ability to project power against Israel, and that's part of the ballistic missile attack that transpired. Mercifully, it appears there was maybe one casualty as a consequence of this 200 or so ballistic missile barrage. Israel has threatened swift action against Iran and its proxies throughout the region. It's yet to be seen what the response is going to look like. Not clear yet if Israel is going to go all the way, target Iran's leadership, even though they've shown that they can take out Hamas leaders on Iranian soil, for example, and key personnel involved in Iran's nuclear program on its soil. Whether it's going to go after nuclear infrastructure, again, the oil and energy infrastructure, which of course fills the coffers of the malocracy and funds all of its proxies in the region. And then it's also worth noting, first of all, well, a couple more things. Israel has also started, in a sense, a ground invasion into southern Lebanon. And that, as well as the taking out of Nasrallah, was all in the face of a Biden administration, which right after October 7th commanded Israel essentially, do not strike Hezbollah decisively, which subsequently, as the tensions increased with Lebanon, and by Lebanon, I mean Hezbollah, because it controls the country essentially, directed Israel, we really want a ceasefire. Biden continues to maintain that posture, it seems. And the administration had been laboring to come to a quote unquote diplomatic resolution between Lebanon and Israel, which again would have made for untenable conditions for Israel and benefited Hezbollah's position in no small part because the US government has pumped billions of dollars over the years into Lebanon, all redounding to the benefit ultimately in protecting Hezbollah because it's part and parcel of the entire Iran first policy of trying to create some kind of balance of power, but really an imbalance of power on Iran and its proxy sides against Israel. So what's really significant at the end of the day in the Nasrallah assassination, the pager attacks, and now the ground invasion is that Israel is saying we're not going to be constrained by the handcuffs, by the bear hug that the Biden administration has sought to impose when it comes to defending its national interests with respect to Hezbollah. Again, it's yet to be seen what that invasion is going to look like. And then, of course, what the response to Iran is going to be from this massive ballistic missile attack. But this is essentially Israel saying, we're not going to be deterred by America anymore in defending our national interests. And again, we'll see what the limits on that look like. I asked the sort of rhetorical question right after the attack. What has the Biden administration promised to Iran and what has it threatened Israel with? And that still bears over this entire situation. But the Biden administration, on the other hand, how hostile can it be towards Israel in the face of what has transpired? That's a politically perilous position, even if everything else pushes them towards the Iran first posture of Obama, Biden, Harris. So all of this is happening right now. It's a live situation. Curious what you all make of the most recent developments, what the Biden administration might do, what Trump and Vance should be messaging about this right now, all live issues with massive implications, ultimately for the U.S. national interest. And last point I'll make is Israel avenged the deaths of hundreds of Americans at the hands of Hezbollah and at the hands of Iran's proxies. And the administration is not cheering Israel on for doing so. And I think that speaks volumes about their posture.
I think you covered a lot very well, Ben, but I'll just throw in that I was kind of surprised at the debate last night that Vance did not bring up the fact that Biden had allowed Iran to take all of this money that had been frozen in sanctions through these hostage deals, which freed them up to fund terror more than they had been during the Trump administration. And Walz tried to do some revisionist history by actually blaming Trump for Iran's rise by leaving the Iran deal, which was just an incredible line of defense. But I think there's plenty of room for them to hit the Biden administration on this aspect of foreign policy, because a lot of people forget that the first time Biden's approval rating started falling was in the summer of 2021 after the Afghanistan withdrawal. And insofar as voters don't care as much about foreign policy, or it's not a top 3 or 4 issue for them right now, they do care about what is perceived as weak leadership in America being embarrassed on the world stage.
Yeah, speaking of weak leadership, I mean, by my count at this point, there are three separate theaters in the world that are have the potential to break into great power warfare. Right? We have obviously Russia and Ukraine. We have the conflict between Israel and Iran that has the potential to bring in the United States, and then China tested, this is just the latest development in the Pacific last week, without telling anyone, tested ICBMs, which apparently made all of our bases and stuff have to go into high alert and lockdown. They did not tell us about it, right? This was somehow completely not reported in the news, like a couple stories. But the world seems to be very, very much in a delicate place where we could easily tip over into a major war in multiple theaters, and we don't have a president. The president, I mean, I know all the sort of pictures of him at the beach are one thing, but we know that he's just not capable, right? Everybody now recognizes that on both sides he's not capable. Kamala Harris is maybe the functional president, but she was off doing fundraisers, this whole week, right? So I don't even know how the deep state resolves, internal conflict at this point, for some extremely delicate and strategic decisions that need to be made on behalf of the United States. I don't know what happens when the chief of staff disagrees with the Secretary of State. Like, how do they resolve that conflict? Right? I don't know. Maybe they go to Obama's Colorama house and have dinner. I literally don't know how they're doing it, but it ought to be shocking to us, and we ought to remember how shocking it is that the United States is literally bereft. We don't just have bad leadership at this moment, we are bereft of any leadership in an incredibly volatile time for the world and for our allies. And that is, it's not a good place to be in as the country with still the world's most powerful military.
Yeah, really an incredible week. I think Israel really demonstrated its complete ownership of Hezbollah. If it didn't with a pager attack, it certainly did with the killing of Nasrallah. That's just remarkable. I mean, Iran is going wild, shooting 200 ballistic missiles at another country, at all their civilian areas. Even if they get intercepted, that's an act of war. This is, and it's even more so than the drones, which you could say, oh, it's a little bit of symbolic because the drones are so slow and blah, blah, blah. But no, I mean, you shoot 200 ballistic missiles at a country at once, you're hoping that they hit, you're hoping that they kill people. And they only didn't because it turns out Israel's tech is so good that they couldn't stop it. I think very bad things are coming the way of Iran. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a very, very aggressive response from the Israelis. Okay. Finally, we're going to go to Inez, who's going to tee off the dockworkers strike.
Yeah, so this has another October story. We're recording this on October 7th. It seems we've had quite a few October surprises already, and it's only the second day of October. But so there is going to be a major dockworkers strike. I think we're on the second day or the first full day of this strike. It's a strike that's going to take place mostly on the eastern seaboard from Maine all the way to the Gulf. I guess that's not technically the eastern seaboard, around the tip of Florida. And There was a viral video of the union boss explaining why the dock workers are going on strike. Obviously, this kind of strike has enormous potential to disrupt supply chains in the United States. We are likely all going to feel the effects of the strike if it goes on for more than a few days. He also laid out the dock workers' demands. It's an interesting. So first, let me go through what he said actually before I move on to sort of the consequences of it. They are looking for raises and for certain guarantees against automation of dock working and dock loading boxes and so forth. So I guess their current pay is anywhere from a starting pay of $20 an hour up to $39 an hour. And they do have quite generous benefits already. And that's some of the critique that has gone around is that, you know, this is not a low paid job, right? A union dock working job is not a low paid job. It's actually still a fairly well compensated job. In the video, the boss of the union pointed out that, you know, these are people who went to work every day throughout the pandemic when everybody was working from home and took on the risks of doing that. Now they want to be compensated for it. So the specific demand is an increase, 77% increase in pay, but over the course of 7 years. So about a 10%, you know, every year increase. And they point to inflation as to why that's necessary, but also just to be compensated, I think, for in part the massive increase in volume in shipping and during the pandemic, and the fact that they were the ones working when everybody had their email jobs at home. You can see even by the way that I'm describing this that I agree with Donald Trump's remarks that he made to the press briefly. He hasn't spoken at length about this, but he said basically I can see both sides. On the one hand, that they are compensated quite well. These are not, you know, in the lower quartile or even probably the lower half of sort of struggling American workers. On the other hand, they do have a point about the pandemic, and they do have a point about you know, the fact that they had to keep working while the rest of the country ground to a halt, and then relied on them for solidly 2 years, maybe going into 3. And anyway, I think it's an interesting issue. It has, again, enormous potential to affect the election. I just mentioned that Donald Trump has spoken out on this in a rather unusual way for a Republican candidate, right? There's just this very interesting realignment mix of commentary on this from both the left and the right. Where you would traditionally find the Democratic Party aligned with union interests. Now you have some pushback from Democratic officials who are clearly not don't like being told about kind of held by the not to get too graphic, but held by the balls by this guy who's very like direct. This union boss is like almost like a character out of a movie, right? He's like, I can bring you to your knees, and I will. Very, very direct about threatening the whole country. So there is some pushback from the Democratic side. And then again, Trump being very sort of moderate and noncommittal and saying he sees both sides of the issue and hopes they come to an agreement. I do think this is indicative, again, of a changing politics around unions, around working class Americans, and where their vote is going to go. I don't know what you guys think about any of that, but I find it sort of interesting, and I find that I don't have very strong instincts about this issue in a way that I think I would have, 4 or 5 years ago. I really do identify with what Trump said. I guess I'm not always a down the line Trumper, but I do identify with what Trump said. I can see both sides. And on the one hand, these demands seem pretty high, and it seems like their jobs are pretty comfortable. Oh, and then one other thing you guys should all weigh in on if you have thoughts about it is the automation piece of this, right? The potential, the national security potential for problems with automation. Can we be hit by a cyber attack that would take out our supply chains if we don't have human dock workers, for example? On the other hand, is it possible to fight these kinds of, movements of technology over time, making certain jobs obsolete? I don't know. Anyway, lot to dig in there in terms of our changing politics, our changing technology, and potential national security and election implications.
Yeah, I'll go ahead. Start on this one. I see a weird kind of antitrust problem here, which I don't think is really talked about in the context of union labor. But the way that the Daggett, who's the negotiator for the ILA, was talking, he's like, if you don't give me what I want, everybody, the economy is going to crash because I'm going to hold my guys out in the street and everybody's going to get laid off because I can stop all goods from coming into the country. And I thought to myself, well, that seems like you're a monopoly, because if you weren't a monopoly, like if you were just talking about one port, it's like, well, if you were shutting down one port, well, people could ship their goods to another port. It would be annoying, but they could do it. But you're saying, no, I'm just going to stop all goods from coming in on the East Coast. It's like, well, and then you're using that position to extract exorbitant salaries and rents for your people, well beyond what comparable blue collar workers might be getting. That seems like a monopoly. It seems like you have a monopoly on port labor and port labor over too large a period, and are using that monopoly to extract rents and hurt consumer welfare, which is like a classic antitrust problem. If it was a business doing this sort of thing, we'd obviously see it, but we don't see it with a union. And so, I want to say that I've become more pro-union over the years more generally, but I kind of think that you shouldn't get to just unionize every single port on the Atlantic Ocean under a single union with the ability to take all of them out on strike and shut off all goods coming into the eastern part of the United States. And I think that their ability to do that is what's preventing automation, which would make things a lot cheaper for everybody. I mean, so I don't know. I think they might have been a little short-sighted with how aggressive they've been in terms of their willingness to shut down the economy. I think they're probably going to get what they want in the short term, but I think in the medium term, there's a big public policy issue of letting these people hold the entire economy hostage and stop automation, which would make everything in our country cheaper.
I think this is definitely a political potential black swan. If we do really have a massive shock to supply chains and then the economy overall, and early voting is already starting in several places. And then you have the Biden-Harris administration not really able to help negotiate and break the sort of gridlock. That could be a real political liability. More broadly, I think, to Will's point, and even setting aside the antitrust issue and monopoly implications, also, what does it say that we're so vulnerable that like you can have one union that could bring the economy to its knees? And you can imagine that there are analogs in a whole slew of other areas as well. That strikes me as us being very fragile and one of myriad potential weaknesses that can be exploited by adversaries or, just for political gain, can be used as a bargaining chip that's really threatening ultimately to the health and the viability and the dynamism of the country. So that seems problematic in and of itself. The last point I'd make, and this is sort of tertiary, but I saw an article, I think it was in the Philadelphia Inquirer, talking about how really working class voters there have had a massive shift to the right in recent years, and that this potentially imperils the Harris-Walz campaign in Pennsylvania, because if they're losing the dominant margins and turnout in the Philadelphia area and surrounding, that obviously could be massive in a state that was separated, by tens of thousands of votes last time. And we also saw with the Teamsters, when we looked at the polling within the rank and file, how they were almost 60% pro-Trump over Harris. I do wonder, what do the rank and file look like here in terms of dock workers, and what are the implications associated with that as well? Is there a potential threat of a backlash against Harris, Walz, I guess, ultimately, to the extent Biden-Harris doesn't come to some sort of a resolution that they've deemed favorable? So all of those are interesting political implications. And then the last thing I think is, as a matter of prudence, ultimately there's a trade-off between economic orthodoxy and potentially, what we think is the best in terms of lowest cost goods and services, most widely available, et cetera, versus winning politically and trade-offs on other issues. And I think ultimately that is part of the transition of the right to being more working class favorable, sympathetic to the concerns of labor, union, and working class American considerations. I think this is ultimately in part an issue of the common good and how we sort of deem it and what need be done to achieve it. And then also, as a matter of political prudence, trade-offs that have to be made on certain issues to win large enough majorities to be able to execute overall an agenda more favorable than what the status quo was. And that's something that the party is grappling with. To the extent the kind of Trump Vance vision ultimately prevails, I think you'll see much bigger gains among these constituents, and it's going to lead to a change in policy and a change in what constitutes conservative orthodoxy. But ultimately, this game is about winning and then effectuating your agenda, and winning in particular in the areas you care about the most. And it's a game of trade-offs. And I think you're seeing that reflected and illustrated as the Republican Party transitions what its agenda looks like.
Right on the political implications for the Democrats, Ben, because the Biden-Harris administration finds itself in a very difficult spot here. Biden cannot invoke partly because that would kill any semblance of a chance that the Harris campaign has of performing at all decently with union voters, because she has been hemorrhaging those compared to when Joe Biden was at the top of the ticket. But at the same time, they are already facing the feeling from voters that they have been very bad in the economy, that people are not feeling like the economy has recovered from COVID. And one of the first big economic shocks during the Biden administration was in the fall of 2021, when we had a similar supply chain crisis. And at the time, the Biden administration downplayed the effect that this had on American families, with Jen Psaki from the podium referring it to the tragedy of the treadmill that's delayed. They clearly have demonstrated that they don't know how to talk about these issues in a way that is compassionate or understanding of the average plight of an American family or an American worker. So they're really stuck between a rock and a hard place. I don't know how they're going to navigate this in a way that keeps them all of their coalition sort of melded together. And it's going to be a very tight balancing act for them. And I'd be curious to also know the political breakdown in terms of Trump versus Harris of members of this union. Similarly, the United Auto Workers Union, whose president has endorsed Kamala Harris. But with that, I think I'm going to actually move to final thoughts. And mine is that the Daily Mail has dropped a story this week about Doug Emhoff allegedly abusing one of his exes. There was a previous story about how he got a divorce because he impregnated the nanny. And this is conveniently the man that the mainstream media has been calling us is the new healthy version of masculinity, and the sort of new vision of what a supportive husband should look like. And alas, it turns out he's actually quite a horrible person who treats women very badly. And it's sort of a classic representation of the performative male feminist that actually demonstrates all of the worst traits of manhood while outwardly emasculating these days.
Yeah, my final thought is about the indictment of New York Mayor Eric Adams. So this indictment dropped about 5 days ago. It is, I mean, so on the one hand, the charges in here are basically, it sounds bad on the surface of taking money from, including from foreign governments, for favors. On the other hand, when I read the charges, and I'm curious, I know Ben probably has a different final thought, but I'm curious what Ben thinks as a, a lifelong, sort of New York area person, as opposed to me who's a transplant. But I always assumed that somebody's palm was getting greased in New York for these kinds of things. So just to give an example of the sort of stuff that we're talking about flight upgrades and hotel rooms, for example, from Turkey to get their consulate building in Midtown Manhattan through some of the layers of aggressive permitting process and bureaucracy that exist for builders in the city. That's the level of stuff that we're talking about. And frankly, I would be surprised if previous mayors were not engaged in some level of this. So I do think that lends some credence to Eric Adams' charge or response to the charges, rather, that he's being singled out. Of course, he denies it entirely. It seems to me pretty clear that he's guilty of some of these things. But he denies being guilty at all. But I more see a case of selective prosecution, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's because he embarrassed his own party by pointing to the fact that New York City has spent, I think it's at the last count, is $5 billion in the last 2 years on services for migrants, and the attendant criminal and sort of order problems that have come with that. He has been relatively outspoken for a Democrat about those problems. He's also kind of a moderate on some of the most important issues. Like, he is fighting the city council on some of their insane stuff, particularly regarding crime. Now, he hasn't been a great mayor. He's not very effective. He's kind of seems like more interested in getting hotel upgrades from Turkey than actually seriously taking on some of the ideological problems in New York City that are leading to crime, to disorder, to the general decline of the city. That being said, these charges read to me as kind of ticky-tack stuff that I would just assume is happening in most large cities in the United States, frankly. And my overall view is on this kind of Tammany Hall style corruption is, if you pave the streets and pay the cops and the city is running, then you get your honest graft. But when the city is in decline, it, obviously is upsetting to people if you're not doing your job. Eric Adams is sort of in the middle, where I think he's probably doing the job better than whoever's going to replace him, who is somebody, apparently the person who will come in and replace him for the interim is a far left ideologue who is almost certainly going to make all of the issues, particularly surrounding crime in the city, worse. So for now, I'm kind of standing with Eric Adams. I think this kind of low level corruption is not a surprise, and not worth switching him out for somebody more ideologically hard left. And I do wonder if this has to do with behind the scenes, hits between Democrats, in the same way that taking out Andrew Cuomo on Me Too allegations was something going on behind the scenes with Democrats. So that's what's going on in America's largest city.
So I'll respond to that and then pivot to a different topic. I guess from the 30,000-foot view, I'm sure that Eric Adams is corrupt. He may have committed the crimes alleged against him. I think he's been a bad mayor in terms of crime, the antisocial behavior on the city streets, the general dysfunction. There's been a massive decline, really, since Bill de Blasio entered office. And Adams has put himself up as sort of the faux moderate, definitely versus the city advocate who's supposed to step in. He looks moderate, but you're grading on kind of a curve here when it comes to New York. But to Inez's point, there are a lot of tells that this is selective prosecution, beyond the fact that, and let me start with the fact that when you do go into the charges, the prosecutors, the DOJ, really inflates what transpired. So they quote this $10 million in campaign contributions headline number, which is not the value of the straw donor funds that were allegedly contributed to him by those tied to, for example, Turkey. $10 million, I believe, as I read it, is the overall number of contributions, in part through, I think, up to 8-to-1 matching of public funds that New York gives to candidates. But they say, essentially, I'm paraphrasing here, that some portion of these funds are attributable to straw donors. Okay, so how much money came from straw donors of the 10 million? But they quote the 10 million number as the headline because that gets the headlines.
But just to back up your point about the inflation, they also count all of the sticker prices of the hotels, which anyone who's ever been to a hotel, if you look on the wall, on the door, it'll say, you're in some like Motel 6 room, and it says the nominal price of this is $550 a night, right? And you're paying $125. They use the high numbers, the sticker prices of the hotels, not accurate prices.
Exactly. And I'm sure that this is what prosecutors do. They lay out the maximally damaging, either on the merits or on the politics, and we can debate whether it's the merits or the politics here, case, to try and make the person look as awful as possible for their case. But they have to inflate and strain. That's a tell to me. The Turkey angle looks bad, and any association with foreign governments, I think, raises serious questions. But the alleged, underlying offense at the end of the day of like greasing palms to help smooth out a permitting process. I mean, this is so piddling relative to the stuff that's probably out there on almost every single big city mayor. And also, of course, ties to foreign powers. If there was really scrutiny done on our politicians, I mean, we could start with Tim Walz and we could go down the list. I wrote extensively on the late Dianne Feinstein, her ties to China. I mean, these are just everywhere in our politics. So that raises the question of selective prosecution and why. And the three cases that I would point to in terms of where the DOJ has gone after prominent Democrats are Bob Menendez. Now, Bob Menendez under Obama Biden was originally pursued by the DOJ. The DOJ failed to secure a conviction against him then. Why did they go after Bob Menendez? I will always hold that it was because he was probably the most prominent Democrat who demolished the case for the Iran nuclear deal, which was purportedly the signature foreign policy achievement of Obama Biden. He was out there and he went chapter and verse pounding the Iran nuclear deal and opposing it. And this is someone who had the heft of ultimately being the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So that's substantial. The first prosecution failed. Biden-Harris went after him again, and it's worth noting, I dug this up, Menendez again came out very strongly against the Biden administration's Iran policy, which was in part about reprising the Iran nuclear deal. So this time they finally got Menendez. Again, likely the alleged offenses there, indefensible, no doubt corrupt, no doubt imperils U.S. national security. But would the charges have been brought against him had he not opposed the Iran nuclear deal and then returning to it again? I think it's very debatable. Henry Cuellar, another person who's been targeted by the Biden DOJ. The FBI raided his house, I believe, on the eve of a very hard-fought Democrat primary in 2022, where he came within hundreds of votes of losing to a progressive challenger. And then they indict him down the stretch of the 2024 election. Henry Cuellar, immigration hawk, certainly relative to the Biden administration, the last so-called pro-life Democrat in the House, and he's been out there attacking the Biden administration's immigration and open borders policy. Would he have had his house raided by the FBI and then faced indictments had he not taken that posture? And then we get to Adams, and Adams, it's the same thing, the immigration issue. Notably, he was supposed to go down to meet with White House officials in 2023, I think it was in November of 2023, to browbeat them and plead his case essentially for why the Biden administration policies are killing New York. And that same day, one of his ex-top fundraiser also got raided by the FBI. He doesn't go down to Washington, D.C. to have the meeting, cancels it. He's put up the defense that this is about his immigration posture. We'll see if that ultimately washes, but the only prominent Democrats who seem to go down, it appears, are those who oppose the administration's policies. And I think that is very telling. Really quick pivot, just note, I talked, I think last week about the Biden DOJ putting forth this guidance about all of the restrictions on states and non-state actors working to clean voter rolls in the run-up to the 2024 election, including concerning non-citizens, wrongly ineligible non-citizens on the polls, on the rolls rather. The Biden DOJ has now filed suit against Alabama for one of its voter list maintenance practices, targeting potential non-citizen voters on the rolls. They claim that this process violates the quote-unquote 90-day quiet period, the last 90 days up to an election where there are restrictions placed on states on what they can do to clean their voter roll lists. This is going to be a case worth watching. It raises the question, can you only remove illegal aliens and non-citizens from the rolls before 90 days prior to an election? I'm right now going through, looking at the lacking, frankly, case precedents to look to here on this 90-day quiet period, what it means for list maintenance efforts, and then going back in the congressional record and looking at what the debate was at the time of the motor voter law being negotiated, which ultimately led to the laws that are on the books. But worth noting what the DOJ is doing to combat states trying to clean their voter rolls in the run-up to this race, and now we're seeing litigation on it.
All right. I don't really. I'm just going to pass on final thoughts today. We'll do that another time. So we'll just wrap up this podcast. So on behalf of Amber, Inez, and Ben, thanks for tuning in. I'm Will Chamberlain. See you at the next NatCon Squad.